This picture reminds me of a lot of the things that I love about life in general. The adventure, going to wild places, going climbing with friends and family, traveling all over the world. And, in cases when I'm giving this talk for people who aren't climbers, it doesn't seem maybe like it fits totally, but I think when you look at the work that I do, there's a real connection between my interest in being outside and going climbing and finding these beautiful places and the work that I do so much right now, which is really creating these venues for life. And in this particular case, we're going to be talking about climbing facilities specifically, but these venues really are anywhere where we're combining work, play, and community or family. Really, it's just those key aspects that I think is really what we're investigating here to create these venues for life that combine those things in a meaningful way. They're really places that we grow, they're places that we evolve as people, and we get to do this together. And so really, this isn't a talk about how to be doing anything, it's really just a talk about the different ways that I think about putting these facilities together. And I really wanted to be starting with a thank you. And the reason why is because I have a lot of gratitude for being here. I'm really thankful for climbing and what it has done for me personally. And I'm really very thankful to be able to be here to help everybody who's watching or listening to this video. And when I look back at the last 25, 27 years of my life, going back to when I was a 15-year-old, I was this barely 5 feet tall, less than 100 pounds kid in high school. I was in special needs classes, being told that I wasn't able to keep up with my peers, both physically and even, in typical school. And I really, found climbing at a point when I was this 15-year-old, and it was this immediate way for me to dig into something. It suited me. It immediately was something I was very comfortable doing, and I just really went into it very, very deeply. And it took me out to Colorado, where I did my undergraduate work and also was very fortunate to be exposed to architecture. And I completely fell in love with architecture. And so in the early 2000s, I started really getting into my work in college and starting to thrive really for the first time ever in a academic setting. And as I was also climbing a lot, I was competing. I finished top 10 in nationals one year and got absolutely smoked by other professionals like Chris Sharma, among others. And it was pretty obvious to me that they were at a level, even though I was climbing pretty well, they were at a level that was a step or two or even three beyond where I was at. And I ended up having a climbing accident where I broke my arm climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park. And it ended up really sort of getting me to start thinking about graduate school. And would I want to go back to school and pursue architecture at a higher level? And that's when I ended up moving back to Boston to go to Harvard. And looking back 10 years before that, at a time when I was in classes that were very remedial, this seemed like an opportunity that was worth taking. And so it's the sort of irony of life. So much of it for me personally has had to do with just when I get really inspired by something, it tends to lead to better results. And so, both climbing and architecture have really given that to me. And that's part of why I'm so grateful, is because I don't really know where I would be if it wasn't for finding these things to really sort of dig into entirely. And so, climbing has taught me so much about life in general. And the reason I have this sort of resume up is because it keeps coming back to being the center of my life. And so, after graduate school, I got back into climbing again. I started climbing pretty well for a guy in his 30s. And, I ended up actually having a reconstructive shoulder surgery. And so even more recently, coming back to climbing again, now with a repaired shoulder, now with two little beautiful girls, climbing once again is an entirely different thing for me. And now being able to work independently after doing development for Brooklyn Boulders for almost a decade, and being able to work independently with different gym owners has been fantastic. And so climbing continues to be the central aspect of really my entire life. And I'm just so happy to be able to work in this venue and be sharing my experience with you, hopefully to help you have successful projects. And so that's really what these venues are really intended to be. And when I first started climbing outside in Colorado, I'd already been climbing quite a bit, and it really was about, how hard can I start climbing and where can I go, traveling, finding these beautiful places, these beautiful boulders or whatever they are. And, really quickly I started designing climbing gyms. This was the end of college and my first job really after college for about 3 or 4 years in the early 2000s, designing climbing walls for the El Dorado Wall Company. As I went back to graduate school and started doing other architectural work, different commercial projects, aquariums, and law schools, and even prefabricated housing. And one thing I learned about really quickly was I had a very strong connection to actual construction. I got into architecture to be building things, and that's not the case for everybody. And so, I like doing prefabricated work because we had a very direct connection with the people who were building in our own factory. And the problem that we were designing wasn't just the final image, it was the whole process. How do we design, engineer, manufacture, ship, install, and then live in the house itself? And so that sort of thinking, I think, really has led into the development work that I was doing for Brooklyn Boulders, where this is the final image. But really, in terms of project development, it's really about taking a sketch, like the very earliest ideas that we have, taking that, figuring out what the key goals are, what we're really trying to do here, developing that into a bit more detail as we have more information, and then just continuing to develop it over time so that we end up with visualizations and modeling that becomes the script or the rough draft of the project as it develops further with a much larger team. And that's really what I'm doing today as well. And so this talk really isn't necessarily how to be doing anything, it's really how to be thinking about it. And the reason that that's so critical is because this has so much to do with the mindset that we are all bringing into this process. It has everything to do with your own experiences, your own preferences, my own experience and preferences, and then really importantly, figuring out what your intentions are. Without knowing what your intentions are, what your goals are, I can't really give you very much. I can certainly come up with things, but really a lot of the innovation comes from that back and forth between you as the client and me. And so we're going to talk about that in a minute, but the drawings that we're making are just the result of the process that we go through together to take an idea, to take a dream, and really evolve that into something that's a physical space. And so again, this isn't really, ironically, how to. It's because it's really about how to think about it, because so much of this is really a response to you. It's really that back and forth. And that's why this is a series of Einstein quotes where he talks a lot about, not being the smartest guy. He's talking about how education is learning, not necessarily learning facts, but learning how to learn, really, and how to think. And so I certainly learned that when I was in college, where just having some people set up the situation for me to dig in and for me to be learning, that was the thing that transformed my whole life. It wasn't being told what to do. It was about understanding the way that we can be thinking about things, understanding how other people think about things, and then taking bits and pieces of that to sort of figure out what works for me. And that's definitely how I go about when I teach college classes, which I've been doing for a while now. And it really, because I can't be force feeding information to anybody. I'm not really interested in that either. But what I am interested in, just like, again, Einstein here, talking about how explaining things simply, because that really shows a true understanding. Because if you can't explain it in a relatively simple way, like most things should be able to be boiled down that way. And there's a really important distinction with, there are very specific terms and words and ideas, but in general, the narrative and the explanation that we have, whether it's for your business model or for the design itself. That's really important. And this is one of the things that we talk a lot about as we keep going forward, is being able to narrate your intentions, because by being able to narrate your intentions, it shows that you understand what you're actually trying to do. And when Einstein talks about the idea of being a genius, he's not saying that he's a genius ever. He's talking about how he basically is like a child. He's thinking like a child even as an adult, and that most adults stop thinking like children. And the reason why this is important in a world where you are actually trying to come up with something new, or new ideas, or in our case, new ways of making facilities, it's because imagination doesn't exist. You're not imagining something that already exists. It's not about going from where you are today to somewhere that you already see. It's about using our imagination to figure something out that's new, to chart a new path, not just from A to B, but to wherever our imagination takes us. And that's more ambitious than just sort of following someone else. And so that's why, he talks about imagination being the preview of life's coming attractions, which, again, I do think that that's really what we're here to do today, which is to create a situation where we're imagining things together that probably don't exist yet, but that's really how we get to a goal of making world-class facilities, not just copying something that we've seen somewhere else. And I think that's important, because I'm not claiming that we're saving lives literally, but I do genuinely think that we are helping people have better lives. And I do think that I can say that genuinely, because climbing has done that for me. Climbing has completely changed my life. It has been this through sort of path in and out of my life in different aspects for, again, almost 30 years now. And that's really why I'm here to be doing this work, is because this isn't just about filling a gap in a market. It's about inspiring people in a genuine way. And so when we're talking about actually designing a space, which is what we're here to talk about, again, this isn't a how-to, but we're going to go through generally how I think about designing a space, really from a sort of abstract level into some very specific case studies. And so the work doesn't just show up. The mindset we bring in, the experiences, and our own preferences that we bring to a project, the drawings are a result of sort of working through all of that. And when we look at the current climate, even business schools, this is the D school at Stanford, where they're taking sort of design thinking, as they call it. We are all designers, and that's great. IDEO, another product design company, they do this really well as well. They sort of categorize things into these phases. And I do think that there's a lot of value in that, in the sense that, especially when you're working with teams, especially when you're working with people who are sort of process oriented, like in different companies, this makes a lot of sense. But to me, I think it's actually even more simple than that. So this is a image of the Don't Look Up movie. They talk about Carl Sagan in this, the idea of first principles, where Einstein and Sagan were able to make very complicated things into boiling them down into first principles in a very sort of genuine way, where that's what allows you to understand things in a new way, is not being distracted, not being confused, not being sort of pulled away down traditional roads, by sort of really, really uncovering and reverse engineering things in a way that does let you get to first principles. And the reason why I say that, and the reason why I think that is really critical for developing interesting and world-class building projects, is because aesthetics isn't the place that I like to start. Aesthetics are very individual preferences, and it's really difficult to talk about that. You're all different people. You might like a purple car, you might like a white car. It doesn't really matter. The point is that it's all very different. Squares, triangles, it doesn't matter. It's difficult to have a conversation about what's better when there's not a goal that's a deeper goal that we actually are using as a filter. So, for instance, When I ask students to present their buildings in design studios, I'll often ask them to do it without talking about what it looks like. So tell me what it's doing. I can see what it's looking, I can see what it looks like, and those two things together, when we basically cross-reference them, that is what gives you basically like an area that you can produce critique, an area where you can decide, is it doing what you're saying it's doing? Is the thing we're looking at meeting the goal that you're actually trying to achieve? And that's why it's not that aesthetics isn't important. And that's why I love this Buckminster Fuller quote, because he's talking about how it's not that aesthetics isn't important. He says, when I'm working on a problem, I never think about beauty, but when I've finished, if the solution is not beautiful, I know it's wrong. What I get out of this is that he's talking about delaying the judgment of aesthetics. So it's not that it's not important, it is incredibly important. If you're building a project, you're probably spending several $1,000,000. You probably should care about what it looks like so that you like it. It's not that it isn't important. It's that if you don't start with something deeper, it's too surface. It doesn't have enough depth if we're just talking about what something looks like. There's not enough depth there to really engage as much as I think is needed to develop a project in a more meaningful way. And so how do we go about doing that? This is an image that I think is pretty relevant, and it's an album cover. It's about pulling, a white light apart into its different constituent layers. And what Newton was really able to do, though, is also show that you can not only take white light, pull it apart, but use a mirror and actually put it back together. And so he's taking the white light, separating it with a prism, putting it back together again with a mirror or a lens, pulling it, redirecting it with a prism, and then pulling it apart again. And so this sort of taking something and pulling it apart, putting it back together, pulling it apart, putting it back together, that really is how I think of designing things, because we do have to sort of pull it apart to be able to understand it, but then it does have to go back together. So all of that stuff is baked in there, whether or not it's explicit or whether or not it's really super visible in the final iteration. And so one analogy that I do like to use is this writer-director. We all have our own favorite writers, directors, artists. A big part of why we love them is because they have an authentic voice. That voice is developed from their life, from their experiences, from their education, who they've worked with, say in this case, other movies they've made. Whatever it is, these are individuals or maybe small teams, but there is an authentic voice that is coming through that does not resonate with everybody, and that's perfectly fine. I don't expect my voice to resonate with everybody, and that's perfectly fine. But what I am trying to do, and what I think these folks are trying to do, is have an authentic voice that they have a real sort of passion behind, and it makes a lot of sense to people. So, for instance, if a Tarantino movie comes out, I actually don't want to know much about it at all. I just want to go see it because I appreciate his position in terms of where he's coming from. And in his particular case, the reason I use him as an example is specifically because he actually does know all of the technical aspects as well. And so he can be the hipster filmmaker, or he can be the brooding writer who's, putting the script together, by himself with a small team, whatever it is. And then when it comes to actually executing the larger project, there's a much bigger group that is required on the set. And very importantly, he's still involved. He still is participating to keep that vision, that authentic voice that was developed in the script, keep it on track, even as the set and the crew expand significantly. And in his case, he'll jump into different roles. He'll be an actor. He can look through a camera and understand what's going on, because even though he may not be the filmer on a larger movie like this one, he does know what he's looking at. And why that's important is because that means he's not middle management. That means he's not just telling other people what to do. He's able to work with people because he actually knows what is possible. And certainly hiring people that are better than us at certain things is important, but having a degree of technical expertise is really important. So in my case, I'm an architect, I'm a contractor, I've done owner's representation work on site. It doesn't really matter. The point is that all of that is a base of information that I can pull from when I'm talking to these different people, even though they might be checking that box, from a sort of responsibility role. And so, his involvement in projects is far beyond just writing a script and handing it over. It's making sure on many, many levels across many different disciplines that the vision and that authentic voice that has been developed is being executed as fully and across as many levels as is possible. And so when we have a script, that's really where it is starting. It's this passionate voice, this authentic voice, not a committee, something that we actually really care about and is intriguing, and it gets worked out, it gets tested, it involves more people, test reads, whatever it is. Because if it's not good, then really we're just putting lipstick on a pig. And that's the problem when our script isn't good, is that it has a ceiling that's a lot lower because we're really just polishing something that doesn't have as much potential in it because it doesn't have as much depth to it or interest in it. And one of the ways that I like thinking about this is as a jazz trio. And why do I like this example? These individuals, any three of us could get up and grab these instruments and start banging around. But that's not what's happening here. What's happening here is that these people are coming to the stage with a whole lifetime of experience, practice, who else they've played with, their own preferences in terms of other music they like, even the technical tools of their own instruments. These are very particular things that are set up in their own unique ways. And all of that knowledge, all of that practice, all of that technical expertise, none of that is actually being discussed here, which is again why, even though I've got my different sort of backgrounds and certifications, that's not what we talk about. What really matters in an image like this with a jazz trio is what is the final result. But that final result is not possible at a high level, at a world-class level, without having a very strong base of understanding and technical knowledge and an ability to work with other people. This whole thing, making and developing projects, is a team effort. When I say that it starts with a small group, that's really anticipating that there is a much bigger team that needs a very, very specific core to be focusing on as the project moves along. And another example of that would be in an interview with Harvard Business Review, Deepak Chopra talks about the sort of self-help world, and the interviewer is asking him about that. And his comment is that, yeah, there's a lot of people out there who may or may not be as helpful, but I'm also a medical doctor, and he's practiced, he has run institutes. He's bringing these credentials that are that's not important necessarily for treating patients, especially if he's writing books or doing, things like that he does a lot of now. But those are the foundation that allows him to understand, the processes of working, the processes of developing research, whatever it is. It's this lifetime, decades of experience that are setting the groundwork for what he's doing now. And that's, again, why I like these as analogies for what I do. And in the best case scenario, a very small team is able to make a lot of noise. So, a three-piece band can make a ton of noise if you have the right experience, if you have the right technical sort of basis, and if you are working together in an efficient way, you can make a ton of noise as a very small team. And that's really the goal. And that's why when I talk about setting things up with clients, this is a diagram that I use, because what we're really trying to do here is work in this beginning phase. This is where we're dreaming up our projects, because these projects really are dreams. These are projects that are ambitious. They should be things that have been stuck in your mind for a long time. We work on these early concepts. We do test fits. We do prototypes. We try feasibility studies, whatever it is, and we develop it to a concept and a schematic design degree of detail, which is pretty early, but that is enough to have a very clear draft or a very clear script of what the future project will be, because that's the framework that we then use as you again, eventually begin to document and then eventually begin to build the project. And so why do we do it this way? Part of the reason that I think we do it this way is because we're basically delaying the amount of money that needs to go out the door that is significant until you get to a certain point where you're convinced that the project should go forward and it's worth spending, a lot more money, 6 figures on documenting a project with a bunch of local professionals. This is how commercial development groups do this that are in-house to a larger company. When I was running teams like this, we do this work in-house because, first of all, we have a tremendous understanding of what we're trying to do. We understand the shorthand of the business in terms of what works, what doesn't work. We don't have to play telephone with outside professionals. We have a very small team internally that works very quickly to do test fits, concepts, test business model assumptions, whatever it is, to work very, very quickly so that by the time we get to this documentation phase, it's really about just running to the finish line. And that's why I work this way with private individuals and companies, is because that way of working allows us to be very, very nimble, very lean, very efficient, less communication issues up and down the line, so that we have that script, and that's how we really develop it in an efficient way. And so as we move forward, one of the reasons why that is so important is because when people start doing business model planning, a lot of times they will actually, try to work on the business model and the funding together. And this gap can lead to missed assumptions. It can have sort of major issues that actually aren't really known until you start doing the blocking. And so my preference is to be really looking at the space planning and the business modeling very, very close together. And the reason for that is because if you can get the business model and the spatial planning and the visualizations really working together, it becomes a much more clear story that you're trying to sell to someone, that you're trying to get support for, whether it's from a building department or a zoning hearing or just getting money for your project. When you can sell and show a business model and images that are both extremely compelling and work, meaning they're not, a budget that's way off or designs that aren't really feasible, that's a great way to go about getting support. And so that's why, the drawings that I make are really tools. They're not just pretty pictures. That's not enough. They have to be tools that actually significantly advance your project forward. And so when we move, when I look at this development life cycle, I break it out into different phases. It's not always this direct in terms of how it goes, but the way that we actually break it up in terms of design is that the design is really this sort of middle chunk. There's a whole lot of work that goes into this that is about project organization, early phase, high value planning, finding spaces, and then eventually construction. This focus of this talk is going to be much more on design, even though development overall encompasses a lot more than that. I do offer workshops and things like that that are more encompassing of the rest of this, meaning the early involvement in the building. But for this talk, we're going to be focusing much more specifically on design. One thing that I can say is that we've come a long way. This would be an amazing example of a gym back when I was a kid. We had pea gravel and walls that were 20 feet tall. It was just a very different way of looking at climbing facilities. And that's just what it was, almost 30 years ago. And that's fine. But today, we actually are in a situation that's completely different. We have the ability to dream. Our imagination is what's required to be creating these world-class facilities. And that's why I look at the improvisation that we have that goes back and forth, just like that jazz trio, as being absolutely critical, because that's where so much of the creativity comes together, and where my ideas as the person making a lot of these drawings with you is really coming from, is that it's not about creating something that we already know. It's about working together and creating something that's even better. And so, it's not about giving and taking. It's really, to me, about creating something that, even though this is a cliche, The goal is really for us to be creating something that is a non-zero sum game, like they talk about in this case in Arrival, where what you're trying to do is create something where you're taking two different parts and together they are actually creating something, interacting with each other in a way that creates something far beyond what either of us could come up with on our own. And so an image like this, to me, sort of shows that, where the bits and the pieces, if you all add them up, are not as much as the sum of the experience when the thing is final. There's a lot going on here that there's no way we were planning for, but people come in, they get inspired, they want to do events, they do these projections, whatever the case is. This is an image that to me, shows that 1 and 1 equals more than 2 when you put the bits and pieces together in the right way. And in order to do that, as usual, we have to start with, why do we even care about this? And at least that's where I like to start it. And I think that's where a lot of people that I work with start, because these are often dreams. These are things that they want to do that are very meaningful to them. And so, again, for me, this encompasses these venues for life where work, play, and family in the extended sense all come together. These are places that we get to grow together, we learn, we have new experiences, and we do this together. And so these types of facilities have evolved a lot in the last, few years. Even the way that we play means a lot of different things for different people. In the climbing world, our climbing gyms have gone from those pea gravel co-ops to these, wild facilities that have co-working spaces. Co-working is this thing that's in the news these days, and so we're going to actually get into some of the specifics related to that, but that also really support family and community, giving a lot of activity for families, kids. We're getting older. A lot of us that grew up climbing are now having kids or have kids already, and it's just like for me, these are my 2 little girls, and it's been tremendous watching them get into climbing, watching them just genuinely fall in love with it. And so once again, climbing for me as a dad and as somebody helping owners with their projects is a completely different experience all over again as someone who's now in his 40s. But in their best iteration, this is really what's going on, where these venues are genuinely integrating work, play, and then family in the sort of wider community sense. We're teaching, we're learning, we're growing together, and we're really being inspired. We're living a good life. And this is way beyond lipstick on a pig. The intention of this isn't an accident that this is possible. It's not that we know what's going to happen, but the intent is to create these important and meaningful facilities. And that's not just polishing something or putting lipstick on a pig. And that's why I think that unique thinking is what gives you the foundation for these types of facilities. And so if we have that sort of why, which is this venue for life idea, then how do we actually get into the design itself? Style and inspiration to me are very important things that, are part of every project. And for me, this aesthetic preference that I have is really about this, the word that I use is clean. Clean, classic, whatever you like. There are certain styles that just persist a little bit more when they just have that clean line, sort of classic style, compared to, more of a flash where, it might just not have the longevity compared to other things. And, when I look at inspiration, I often find it in movies. I've got directors and, visual effects people that I really like who, use lighting in interesting ways, combine lighting, geometry, and framing in interesting ways, and creating moods that are the backdrop for the movie or the film that's, going to be shot there. And again, though, the intent of what's going on. So, setting these things up, yes, they're interesting, but that's not the goal that's not where they're starting. They're starting with, what are we trying to do here? And then creating a set that is creating that mood and the atmosphere through the architecture. And certainly there's other examples that are closer to the venues that I work on mostly, which are, these skate parks and these sort of colorful versions, ones that are integrated into building infrastructure more seamlessly, and certainly climbing facilities as well, which are just this next generation of these wild facilities that are being built all over the world. And so when we go to put these things together, we need to know, first of all, a theory about how these things will fit together, what the ingredients are, and then what the relationships are between them. So this is my favorite architecture theorist, or one of them, Sanford Quinter, and he talks about climbing in some of his lectures. One of the things he's really pointing out is the way that climbers are experiencing the same object at different scales. And so these are all images of Devil's Tower, where you've got the people on the left taking their photo from afar, the person in the middle free soloing, and then the image on the right of the actual grain of the rock itself. And this is how we interact with our climbing facilities as well. But in general, this is the way we interact with architecture. There are different scales of engagement, from looking at it on a drawing to being in the facility to actually climbing on the wall. These different degrees of interaction are unique for each of us as individual people. They're unique for us as climbers of different abilities, whatever the case is, but we're experiencing the same thing in different ways. And further, the idea of inclined surfaces is always something that is important in the way that architecture is defined, because moving across inclined surfaces, or in the world of climbing, maybe overhanging surfaces, is always something that has a lot of technical requirements in the world of architecture. So this is Opera House in Scandinavia. This is Yokohama Port Terminal in Japan. And some of the issues we start seeing in the world of architecture are issues about the flatness of materials. How do we break different surfaces down? How do we deal with landings and other circulation issues that are required? How do you add the handrails and things like that are just needed for the building to operate? You can see the way the handrails have been designed so that they can actually adapt and sort of change their own geometry relative to the surface they're attaching to. You can see landings, every 30 feet or so. Whatever it is, there's actually a lot going on that is baked into the surfacing of the actual architecture that we're inhabiting and moving across. Two things that I think about when I'm looking at designing a building: On Growth and Form, and this book Nudge. The book On Growth and Form, the big takeaway for me is that the word form, I think, often gets misconstrued for aesthetics, meaning, how it looks. Form is really about formation. How did something come to be? And on Growth and Form, they're talking a lot about actually mapping this, or using even math in certain cases to understand how things evolve over time as they grow, as they develop. And that's important, because it's not that we need to be overly rigorous, but having an intent for why something ends up looking like it does, I think, is an important thing. And additionally, the book Nudge is really talking about the idea that we can't be forcing people to do anything, but what we can do is set up conditions where they then are able to interact with a fixed object. So in this case, setting up conditions around the Seagram building in this plaza so that people can sit and move and enjoy it. And then the sort of rarity of when someone actually cuts across it, that becomes actually a sort of unique situation in itself. And we can start seeing that as people start to make things their own. So, when you're talking about like mapping paths, for instance, this is what people end up doing, which we can fight this with things like, ropes and whatever, but we also can observe them and try to set up situations where, in this case at Ohio State, they saw that people were sort of trampling all over the place. And so they ended up reverse engineering that and actually adjusting their own quad to follow more like these desire lines that were being put in by people, regardless of if they wanted to or not. And so this is all just the idea of nudging and providing solutions and ways for people to interact with a fixed object, a built environment, in a way that actually works for them and creates conditions that they understand without you having to be there to explain it. And so when we talk about putting things together, though, we do need ingredients. Like, what are we even making this building out of? And that has a lot to do with your business, what you want to do. This is not going to be standard. These are not standard things. It has to do with, what's the goal? What's the mix? What's the building? What city are we in? What's the context? What are you trying to do with it? Are you doing World Cup events? Are you doing, do you want to do more local events? Do you want to be setting things up with kitchens and bathrooms and, areas for kids? What kind of training are you going to be putting into it? All of this stuff continues to evolve. What type of features, symmetrical walls, lockers, amenities, other spaces like that, and workspaces and whatever it is. And the short version is that I don't know what you each want to include in your project. And the reason for that is because you're all individuals. You're going to have your own preferences, your own desires, your own business model. And so it's not about having a standard list of this is what you need. There are, of course, certain things that we're going to need in most facilities, but it's really about what are the bits and pieces that you want to include. Because from there, we then start talking about what it is that we're actually making. So fitness isn't fitness. They can be all variations of the same type of ingredient, just like in this image, which is showing that using different types of the same ingredient will have a big impact on the final result. So even once we decide what the goal is, the ingredients that we use to get there has a big impact on what the final thing is. And so again, fitness isn't fitness. And even within the certain ingredients we pick, so say we understand what we're trying to do, we pick a certain ingredient, the ratios that we use also matter. The ratios will have an effect on the final result. And then further, the techniques that we use also make a difference. So at every step along the way that we actually put things together, the type of ingredients we use, the way that we use different ratios, these things all actually have a huge impact on the final result. Because it would be ridiculous to just put the ingredients in and not mix them together. That isn't how we do this. We end up mixing them. And the reason we do that is because that's how we actually can get more out of it. It's not A plus B and C is equaling whatever. It's trying to get more by looking for possibilities between these things, between these different components, because of our intent. And that's how we're trying to get more out of it than just what they would be alone. And so when it comes to actually putting them together, ironically, a lot of it has to do with the space between them more than the actual ingredients themselves. And so this is an example of a project in Japan where it's a museum and it's this circular plan where these boxes have been put in place that are able to be grouped in different ways depending on what type of gallery situation is being desired, what type of event is going on. And so it's a fixed framework that allows for multiple different uses. So different entrances, because it's this circular plan. These cubes allow for different variation as people use it in different ways, different users, different events, whatever it is. And that's, again, very much what we're doing here when we take a sketch like this, which is about the relationship between these things. It's not just putting all of these things on a spreadsheet. It might start there, but it's about figuring out how these things relate to each other. What are the visual connections, whatever it is. Developing that further, developing it even further, visualizing it, understanding it, testing it, working fast and lean, and eventually, after a whole lot more time, getting to something like this, where it's a background for our lives to be, these venues where our work and our play can take place. A very specific case study related to this. This is the original Brooklyn Boulders Somerville, which is now Bouldering Project. 2010, this is probably the first time I was in the space at all. Big concrete warehouse, concrete floor warehouse. And this is where we started. And very quickly, we started iterating three-dimensional models to try to figure out what the different components would be, how they would relate to each other. And pretty quickly these things evolve, and you can see even over time how these different bits and pieces, some stay, some grow, some evolve. And there were many times where I would be standing in this space, looking at this, showing an image like this, connecting the dots between what was being built and what the final facility was actually going to be. And the final facility, embodies a whole lot of other ideas that are not necessarily drawn on the plans. And along the way, there's this whole, process of getting there, which can be, certainly a very tricky one. But when we're actually laying out the space, a lot of times I'm looking at the pathways that are navigating through the space as much as anything else. I've always thought of these things as eddies, as ways to collect people in different parts of the building. And so when we start looking at an actual drawing of the Somerville project, so getting really into the details here, the way that this generally works is to block out certain areas that are more fixed, meaning, a lot of times it's mechanical, electrical, plumbing stuff that doesn't want to be moving, bathrooms, elevators, whatever. And those objects are these sort of rocks that are creating eddies where different people are allowed to collect in different areas. And so in this particular case, you've got areas where people are able to, go for sort of beginner and, events and parties where they can have access to event rooms and a sort of event wall right there that's a little bit out of the way. If you're more in front of the main boulder, that's where you've got people looking at you from the second floor, people looking at you from the ground floor. You're really on display there compared to some of these more sort of secondary areas that are a little bit more tucked away. And that's all because, everybody's different. Everybody's going to have different preferences. And so when we start overlaying the lines of sight, one of the main ones in this facility was the fact that you can actually see all the way through the entire facility from one end to another. And again, that's not an accident. That's something that we thought was very striking about this, 300-foot long space. So having these axes about how do you enter the space, how do you have views through it, what relates to other parts, how are you being able to work through the entire facility. And as you move up to the second floor or the mezzanine, it is even more, where you've got these different viewing platforms. You've got this sort of a catwalk that has a view of that sort of beginner or kids area. Where the treadmills are, you've got this great view of the whole space. One of my favorite spots is on the mezzanine, where you can see across the entire facility to this big window on the ground floor that we put in to really connect that visually. And so, across both of the levels, that's really what's going on. And as you start moving through the facility, you end up having circuits that we really do think about during the design process, where you don't have to double back on places that you've already been. You can sort of navigate through this thing in whatever way suits you, whether you're an employee doing a tour or a user who comes into the facility to use it every few days. It really is about exploration. And so we're setting up the conditions for that exploration. And furthermore, when we put in the mezzanine and we raise this roof here, the height that we put the mezzanine at immediately allows you to have a few different things happening. So you've got one height, you've got a full height, you've got the existing height, and then you've got this other height that is the ceiling to the new mezzanine. So right there, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different heights of climbing walls that are being put into the space just by the way that we did two things, meaning we added this roof and then we added this mezzanine. And so these relationships, it's not just the plan, it's the section, it's about how it all relates to each other. And these fixed objects, in this case, the height of the mezzanine and the location of the mezzanine, are the few moves that we use to trigger all of these other things and all these other dynamics across the facility. And so a lot of that is showing up in these very, very early models and as you move forward, because these fixed objects that we put in place, that's where the exploration happens between them. So we're setting this situation up for people to sort of explore the space in between and the relationship between things. And so when you look at a picture like this is that sort of showpiece bouldering wall where you can see the way that the mezzanine is naturally tiered to allow for seating. There's even room for seating down in front where those two people are. And when you look back up, you can see the shorter bouldering wall that is we dialed in the height of the mezzanine to allow for that. You can see the windows that are up there and the new roof that actually give you a view of downtown Boston when you're at the top of the wall. And the sort of amphitheaters that are set up within the facility that when they're not doing a presentation, you might not even know are there. But when you look at it this way, it becomes a lot more clear that this is what's going on. And you can see in the very far distance that window that I was talking about. And certainly this project has gotten a good degree of credit and sort of interest from people not only within the climbing world but also outside of it in the workspace. And that was one of the big things, was the introduction of coworking into this space. But when we're talking about play, the question that I always have is like, what can we do next? How can we make this better? And it turns out the idea of play is actually something that's researched very seriously. And a lot of times when we look at making advancements in our buildings and in our architecture, we look at artists, because a lot of the requirements that buildings have are not requirements in the same way for artistic projects. They don't have the same building codes necessarily, things like that. This is a sculpture by Picasso on opening day in Chicago. And certainly when he put a sloping piece of steel like this at ground level, he knew that interaction was going to be happening. These skateboarders actually made a whole video about skateboarding on Pablo Picasso statues. There are certainly other examples. This is in France, where this is a practice playground element for climbing, which is a wild one. But then there's also folks like this. This is Noguchi, and a lot of people know him for his sculpture and for his tables, like this Noguchi table. But he also did a lot of work with play spaces. And for instance, the carving of this landscape behind him, the way that he would make these kind of ambiguous playground elements, some of which are more obvious than others in terms of how you interact with them. And then other ones that really blur the line between, is this a landscape? Is this a sculpture? Like, what is this? Either way, he's setting up the conditions for people to then respond to. And so some examples of this idea of a fixed object that is set up for interaction. Regardless of golf, what you think about it, golf courses are things that evolve significantly over time. Technology changes, the landscape itself grows, evolves and changes, and things deteriorate. And so things that were set up in one way might end up being in a completely different era as trees are added or trees are removed, as technology changes. And so there often is significant capital expenditure that actually has to go into renovating golf courses. And anybody who runs and owns a facility will know that as well, that these things don't just live as they are. They actually require this sort of evolution over time. And we're going to talk about climbing specifically in just a minute. Another example of this would be racetracks, where the evolution of racetracks changes significantly in a lot of cases, where the cars change, the technology changes, the style of racing changes. What do people actually prefer in a given era? And furthermore, another example of these sort of big open spaces that actually have a lot of organization would be an airfield or an airport, where you can immediately see all of these runways and all of these approach angles that are pretty clearly defined based on what's actually going to be happening. And some of them are drawn more specifically onto the actual tarmac, and then others end up being a little bit more calibrated based on, how sharp can a turn be relative to the speed of a plane as it's being moved. And so there's a calibration that is not necessarily documented in the final object. And, when we look at skateboarding again, this is this idea of finding an object and then making it into something that you're interacting with. So, finding objects, this is a fixed handrail that is then being used in, a way that probably wasn't intended. These skate parks that are more curated certainly are a little bit more, geared for that, and they're set up to be that. And there are projects like the Street Dome in Denmark where they're combining architecture and skateboarding in a way that I think is more meaningful. And part of the reason for that is because they actually brought in Rune Glifberg, this is from anybody who remembers Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. He actually consults on skateboarding projects. And so just like there are people who I work with to bring in as experts, whether it's for skate parks, whether it's for other opinions on climbing, whatever the case is. It takes a collaboration to make facilities that are truly unique. And certainly anybody who says that they're an expert in everything is probably somebody, that I would run away from. And that's not at all what I'm saying, because this is a team sport to get things to be where we want them to be. So regarding climbing specifically, this is what handholds looked like when I was a kid back in the 90s. When this handhold came out, the Boss, this was the biggest hold any of us had ever seen. It changed the way we looked at handholds, and it still wasn't anywhere close to where we're at today, which are these giant volumes that often you're climbing on volumes as much as climbing on handholds. And so this is pretty far from where, handholds started for me, which were these tiny little things. And gyms have evolved, the way that we are using walls outside, the degree of climbing infrastructure inside, the type of features that we're putting in to facilities has evolved into these, deep water soloing things, the events that are going on around climbing, the types of climbing walls themselves, these sort of scaffolding features, the the sort of highball indoor stuff, and even the way that we have people looking at different aspects of what climbing and lighting and the sort of indoor environment could be, and even having outdoor walls that are for ice climbing or just outdoor climbing in general, or super high walls for multi-pitch climbing on the side of, in this case, basically a trash facility, or even just climbing in different parts of the world, walls that are in Japan versus walls that are in other parts of the world. Walls that are, maybe for climbing, but not necessarily in the way that we think of them. And the training elements that continue to evolve over time, the different secondary ways that climbing adjacent things have developed and really taken off. And then just the idea of these play spaces themselves that, every year there's more and more of these things that continue to evolve. And whether or not they're exactly climbing, they're really there for play. And there's always going to be some of us who are much more interested in pure climbing. And then there's a lot of people who are interested in facilities like this that combine, work and play and family in very interesting ways. Furthermore, the backdrop for all of this is the fact that technology is always changing. It's always going to be changing. The way that we use it in climbing is evolving. The features that are available for us to put in our facilities is always evolving. And climbing in general is at a stage right now and on a stage right now where the visibility is very high. There's a lot of room to move forward. Climbing, I genuinely believe that climbing just has a long way to go, and that's a good opportunity in the sense of thinking, where can we take the sport? And that's part of the reason why when I introduce this way of thinking about things, it's about trying to get to deeper issues, trying to get to a way of thinking about our climbing facilities and our climbing walls, which we're going to talk about right now, in a way that moves them forward beyond where we're at today to a more sort of substantial way of thinking about them. So, climbing walls. First and foremost, climbing walls are artificial constructions. These are not mimicking real rocks. That can happen, and that's fine if that's people's preference, but I think there's an opportunity in saying that these are artificial structures. We're going to see what we can do to make the best artificial structures we can for climbing. These ideas can come from anywhere, sketching over different images. I've had the very fortunate experience of working with these two gentlemen over the last decade quite a bit, Phil Shaw and Ty Foose. This is a great example of 1 and 1 equaling more than 2. Both of these gentlemen have introduced ideas to me and different ways of thinking where I truly think that the projects that we were working on together were better because both of us were involved and our teams were involved than one of us just coming up with it on our own. Same thing. What's the mix of ingredients we need here? Even with the climbing wall specifically, how much of this do you have? How much slab do you have? How much of this sort of clean, intimidating overhang do you have? How much of these arêtes? How much of this sort of compression type feature do you have? And certainly in some cases, the climbing walls themselves can take a much more direct inspiration. In this project, we were looking at a lot of Rocklands features as a way to combine flat and curving surfaces that allow you for certain areas to have more volumes than others. And once you start having that idea of what the mix is in terms of what the ingredients are, then it's really about how do we mix it. And as soon as we start looking at climbing walls themselves, the question very quickly becomes, how do we deal with the problem of flatness? And in particular, how do we balance geometry versus the need to be able to attach holds, or in some cases very large handholds, to different types of surfaces? And in a lot of cases like this one, my feeling is that we can combine very specific angles. So in this case, I think this is a 40, and then this is like a 30 back there, and then there's a transition between them. And so being able to combine things that are both very specific and then also a little bit less specific in terms of its angle to create interest in ways that allows for different types of setting, different types of look, and sort of climbing feel, but at the same time realizing that we do need to have these big flat surfaces. And so there are ways that we can combine different types of surfacing geometries. And furthermore, when you look at something like this is a geometry that's totally triangulated and it's propped up. You can see all of those columns, which are quite literally propping this thing up. It really is something like this, where it's a prop that has a structural support. It's almost like when they took it out of the computer and realized, it needed to stand up, all of a sudden that's how you end up with all of these columns. Conversely, there are different types of surfaces that can have more structural properties which are inherent to them. So a hyperbolic parabola, which again, the sort of details are less important than the concept, all of those red lines are straight lines. You may have made something like this as a kid with string, like 4 straight lines that are all twisted relative to each other and connecting the string or the sticks. And what does that allow us to do when we actually introduce certain types of specific geometries, whether in this case it's these primitive objects, which all of these primitive objects, as we call them, can be panelized into flat surfaces. We know that because of their geometry. In a similar way, we can take a hyperbolic surface like is being done here. As you move down vertically, you can start to see the way that down here, we're taking these curves or these straight lines, I should say, from the surface itself. And then what we're doing is we're actually making panels out of them. So these diamonds, because of the geometry that we're using, we know those diamonds are flat. And what does that allow us to do? It allows us to actually make physical objects, real objects, that have geometries that use, in this case, 4-sided flat objects. And that's how you actually get to an architectural scale for buildings like this, where you can't have these surfaces be tortured, as we call it in the boat building world, of just bending wood. These are flat surfaces that are approximating curves. This is another example of that. And then furthermore, when you start sticking to certain geometric rules, so again, this is still a hyperbolic surface, when you start actually working that way, a few things start to happen. So this is a project from the 50s, 1950s. So number one, we know it's a bunch of flat lines within it, and so that helps us creating the formwork. And then furthermore, we can actually make the thing super thin because we know that from a structural point of view, it's working efficiently in compression. So look how thin that concrete is. It's entirely because we are actually using a hyperbolic surface, and it has certain geometric traits that we know exist, just like this example, and it allows us to build things in a very defined way that isn't very complicated. So for instance, in this concrete as well, you can see the formwork where there's these 4 sides that also have the board forming that you can see within it. And so why do we care about this? It's because by knowing what geometry we're using, even though it's a curving surface, it helps us describe it, helps us build it, and helps us build it in a way that doesn't cost an arm and a leg. When you can tell somebody, no, this is actually relatively straightforward to build it, it just sort of has a more complicated final look, that's something that you can actually use to your advantage. If you just tell someone they have to just figure it out, you can just imagine the dollar signs sort of racking up. And so that's my feeling on sort of surface geometry. And when we move into the next step of coloring and applying color and depth to that geometry, the question I always ask is, what are we trying to do? Again, it has everything to do with intent. Are we trying to enhance? Are we trying to confuse? The way that we look at color and light inherently gives things depth. We can apply color in a way where, it helps accentuate different things. And then we can also apply pattern in a way where it can confuse things. So this is a dazzle ship, and the intent here was actually quite clear as well. It was about survival. It was about confusing people who were shooting torpedoes at your boat. It was about trying to intentionally confuse folks so that they wouldn't know exactly where your ship was going. Same thing with the zebra here. It's about survival. The confusion is about, there is an intent to it. In the same way that these same ideas can be applied to other purposes. So in this case, this is applying a zebra pattern to a horse, which actually keeps flies off of them, just like it did for the zebra. Or in the car's case, having this livery that is very confusing, sometimes even confusing photos, so that other teams don't know exactly what you're doing. So it's not about having perfect clarity, it's about having clarity of what you're trying to do, so that when you actually make these decisions, we're not just pushing lines around, because it's really hard to know when you're done. It's really hard to know what's good or not, when all you're doing is just sort of drawing things in a way that doesn't have much to push back on. So a very specific case study, again, this is the Brooklyn Boulders in Eckington that is now a bouldering project. This is the development that the project was in. It's the base of a mixed-use commercial development. The ground floor and the lower level is the Brooklyn Boulders. And just like usual, from the very beginning, we're looking at the way that the climbing and the architecture can mix from the very beginning. This is specifically about the climbing walls. Very quickly, we started seeing that we were going to have these walls sort of in this open space. And so different examples I started looking at related to these types of buildings, or really this type of a object, meaning these sort of icebergs that we started seeing develop. And so usually this starts with sketches, and you can start seeing different things showing up. The relationship between the curved surfaces and the flat surfaces starts showing up really quickly, different ideas about how that might work. You start seeing that develop really quickly in the model, where you can see the panelization and you can see the way color is even being applied very early to try to create different depths and different ways of understanding it. And that just continues to develop over time. And certainly references and inspiration is being pulled from different types of climbs. And so, in this case, there were sort of different climbs that were even being imagined in those sort of three caves that we were developing that were kind of similar to the way a cliff band would have almost like a tougher outer edge. And then at the bottom there, you can see the way that the wall itself is being looked at relative to the building. And so from the very, very, very beginning, this isn't being looked at as a standalone climbing wall or a standalone building project. It's about how they relate to each other. And that's what the sketches are starting to show really right off the bat. And so in the final pictures, a lot of this starts to become evident. And you can start seeing the way that the color and the geometry are creating these different features that have a certain degree of legibility, and you can describe it and you can sort of understand what it is you're actually sort of setting and grappling with. And in these cases, the panelization also allows for you to these are all flat surfaces. Nothing in this image is curving. These are all flat panels because we're using the geometry that we had talked about. And so specifically in this case, this is a parabolic surface where you've got four sides, and then we've gone in here and panelized it into these four-sided shapes. Looking at the final project, looking out of the cave, looking at some of the boulders, looking at the relationship between the boulders and the rest of the building. What are those relationships from the very beginning? And then certainly taking cues from other facilities. In this case, these, this sort of a ramp climb, which I'd seen back in the 90s in Las Vegas. There's other gyms around now that have that, to create additional length within a bouldering facility. And so, these sketches, they start to turn into the actual designs really quickly. And we put the models into the actual building model. And so very quickly, the takeaway is really that these climbing walls are very specifically understood in terms of their surface geometry, the intent, and then also very clearly adjusted and coordinated with the building itself. The building itself and the climbing, you don't see gaps, you don't see different things that are creating sort of, irregularities between the climbing wall and the building. It's all being thought of at the same time from the very beginning. And to me, that's how we get to a world-class facility, and that's really what I'm interested in. So thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it, and I'll see you at the next one. Thanks.